So I think it's 15 past the hour, and that's the time to start. I was just thinking earlier on, I've got my IATI tag mug here from Tanzania, but unfortunately it's broken. The water comes out, so that's a shame. And it's a real shame not to see people and just see this, but hopefully we'll meet soon sometime. So I'm going to start. I'm going to talk for the next period of time about the COVID IATI data that we've worked with. We're the Center for Humanitarian Data. You may have heard of the work that we do also around COVID, but many other things to do with humanitarian data and humanitarian data needs. My name is Stephen Flower. I've been involved in IATI for 10 years now, 10 years. So it's great to be here and talk with people virtually, but the best IATI events are always face-to-face. Okay, so hopefully everyone is in the room, 45 people, I think, and on we go. So the outline for today, I'm going to get through quite a bit. I'm going to talk about, first of all, what have we done by this project. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our team, and I think there's a really interesting story there about our team. Then I want to get quickly into issues we found with IATI data, and I really want to spend some time on that. Then looking at things that users told us, and then we really want to move this on to what are the higher level findings and recommendations that we have as a team for IATI publishers and the IATI standard. So there won't be so much today of demonstrating the tool and the things, because we think it's really important to get into some of the issues. Some of them are very specific, others are much wide-ranging. And I think there'll be plenty of time for discussion as well. So hopefully with my colleagues Nick and Julia will people will put their hand up. I think we'll collect questions and we'll get to those towards the end first. So before I start, I want to invite Ashley Bukuzzi from USAID to say a few words. They're a project sponsor for this work, and hopefully somebody can bring Ashley in and we can hear from USAID.
Oh, you have me, Stephen. I'm here. Hello, everyone.
Excellent.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you so much. So I'm Ashley Bukuzzi. I support donor coordination for USAID's COVID-19 response globally, and it is such a privilege to be here. We are so grateful to our OCHA colleagues. We're in admiration of our OCHA colleagues for the presentations and insights, and so far be it from me to take up much of the time, but I was so tempted to offer a word on how much this work has meant to us at USAID over the past few months. So just a personal account. So I joined USAID last year, and of course at that time, we knew so little about how much we would be relying on tracking aid data for the COVID pandemic and how much we'd need those real-time data updates to be continuing, obviously, to present day, as I'm sure we're all facing. At the time that I joined USAID, just to make all who are in this VCE smile a little bit, I hope, we were manually tracking all donor commitments through, I want to say, more than 30 separate websites, news sites, press releases, whatever we could find, manually keying in numbers on what the news source said a certain donor was sending to a certain country or region or organization, et cetera. And we did this every month for longer than we should admit. So when we started working with the OCHA team, we saw this very exciting real world example on how we could use IATI data to be so much more efficient in our tracking, save ourselves the time, but also help to socialize the value of what IATI can capture and does capture. And so the COVID funding dashboard that we'll see today tells us as I would say, a yet untold story on pandemic spending that many other sites have captured in pieces, but none like this dashboard. And our OCHA team knows I really could go on for days about how helpful it's been to us, and again, how much it's saved us time. But since that is not the purpose of this presentation, I'll just say we are using in USAID, the dashboard now underpins our internal situational dashboard, our situational analytical tools on COVID-19 response to compare how global spend data in certain regions and contexts trends against the pandemic writ large, virus trends, vaccination trends, et cetera, other impact areas. So this is a huge asset to us in our own ability to think analytically, and hopefully that's the same for others. As aid practitioners and as advocates at USAID for strong aid data transparency, we're so significantly invested at this look in the mirror, as I'm stealing from Stephen already into the presentation, and the spirit for ourselves and for all of our peers of continuous improvement. We shudder to think, though I think we've all been wondering the same, how much the insights we glean here will be helpful and relevant in future crises. It's hard to consider that the pandemic has been of such a massive scale, one that I know we've all said more than any in our lifetime have faced. And hopefully we would never need to work at such a scale.
But because of the lack of coordination, there was
maybe that's what I might sound like that in French. Apologies. But we know that there is likely a chance that being able to extrapolate on issue areas or other crisis areas will help us so much. And so it'd be great to consider this world where we're all held accountable to the data stories that we see here, helping us to make those important and difficult decisions and much more efficiently and effectively than the ear to the ground manual mining. That is where we came from last year. So it's been such a pleasure for us to work with this team. They've brought to USAID and our aid partners so much intense illumination, sharp and nuanced insights that I am now officially keeping you from. And so as we dive into the presentation, just would urge you to please consider what the IATI community can learn from this experience and how we can walk away together as change agents for the COVID pandemic response, the decisions that still need to be made, and then of course thinking about what is yet to face our world. And so thank you. Without further ado, back to you, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for the words, and the context I think is really, really helpful. I apologize, I shared my screen whilst you were talking, but I'll try that again. But thanks very much, Ashley. Okay, so back to where we are. So first of all, I want to give you an overview of the project and specifically really the things that we delivered and have with the project. So that's, first of all, you may have seen, but you'll have plenty of chance to see after this short event, the IATI COVID-19 Funding Dashboard. So the funding dashboard takes the IATI data that's published that uses the COVID-19 guidance, and it provides real insights and headlines at a glance figures in terms of how much money has been committed to COVID and how much money has been spent. Alongside that, it also gives an overview of the flows of money between organizations and some indication of the timeline of those commitments and spending as well. So we spent a lot of time with the funding dashboard to get it into the shape where it is. It updates every day, and it reads only IATI data into it. So it's all about IATI data, but as we'll talk about later on, we try not to say IATI too much in amongst it. We tried really hard to make it of use to non-IATI people as well. So that's the IATI COVID-19 Funding Dashboard, and there's plenty to see and do with that. Alongside the dashboard, we also produced what we call a data story. So when we talk to people about IATI data and the dashboard, we also thought we needed to produce something that would give a story, give some insights into the data with some graphs, some text available. And that might be something that's a bit more accessible to people than just going to a dashboard straight away. So we really like the story, the data story. It talks about the real growth in IATI publishing using the COVID-19 guidance. And then we take some specific looks at insights between certain sectors, the timeline of commitments. And in the bottom right here is a really interesting graph where we look at the gap between the commitments and spending in certain countries. The COVID-19 data story is fixed in terms of a data that we had in September, whereas the dashboard updates every night. We didn't want to make the dashboard become dynamic because it would become out of date, but it's a really nice piece for people to share, as we've found. As Ashley mentioned, a real thing, and this is the only cat picture I have, I'm afraid. The real thing that we were interested in here was to produce dashboards and data stories, but hold a mirror up to IATI data. So that became really important for organizations that are publishing IATI data to see how their data looks, but also see how that looks with others as well. And also we found holding that mirror up becomes really helpful to see how you could change your data or how your data compares to others. So it's really key for us not to edit or correct or change IATI data overly, but to try and use it as quickly and as wholesale as we can and hold that mirror up. And that became a thing we would always discuss on our team calls and such. So holding the mirror up to IATI data. Okay, moving on from the cat. We do have quite a in-depth methodology in terms of how we use IATI data here. As I said earlier on, we only use IATI data for this project. We extract the data every night from dPortal. We run that through various processes and algorithms to get summary data that we can then load into the dashboard, for example, every night. So this methodology is very well documented. I know lots of people in the community have discussed this. We've discussed it on, for example, the data use working group calls and elsewhere. And we think the methodology is something to share and something for others to reuse, particularly about how we use IATI data to make these summaries and to make these visualizations. So the methodology was really a key part underpinning the dashboard and the data story. But the methodology came from our team working with USAID and others in the community that we talked to. And I just wanted to reflect very briefly on our team, because I think it's really interesting. You can see here, there were a number of people involved in this project. I am the IATI specialist because I've been around for many years, I think. We had a data scientist, Manu, Mike, getting data, moving data between systems. David Megginson, I'm sure colleagues know, he's an expert in IATI and other standards. Erica made things at the front end that we interacted at the front end and back end, I should say. Erica did a lot more to the front end. Yumi added lots of design experience. Kareem helped us through this, and Sarah was our lead at the center. So there's lots of people involved in this project, which I thought was really interesting. And sometimes IATI projects can be very isolating and very singular. So it's great to work with a wider team. But I also reflected on how much experience between us or each person had of IATI. And I mentioned 10 years I've been around. David's been around even longer with IATI, having been involved in the first version. But most of those people I mentioned before have 0 years experience or very few experience, particularly hands-on experience of IATI. And that was really vital and interesting, because not only did we have to use IATI data, we had to talk to each other and explain lots and lots IATI to our colleagues. You know, we'd have lots of conversations about what is a commitment, why is a commitment outgoing and incoming, etc., etc. So it's really vital that our colleagues could understand IATI, but more about how could we make sense of things with IATI data together and then with others. So hopefully we should see more of these projects over the years of people coming into IATI and working with others to make things, I think. So without getting without getting into the tool and the dashboard, I wanted to sort of focus in first of all on the top 5 things that we encountered. And David and I and Sarah and others, when we were writing the report and such things, really wanted to focus in on 5 things that we found as we used IATI data, IATI data about COVID-19 every day the past few months. So these are the top 5 things that I think people have got opinions on and we should discuss. But first of all, we found when we used IATI data, there were lots of what we called false positives. In other words, we would find IATI activities that maybe had the term COVID-19 in them, but they weren't really about COVID-19. What we found with the IATI COVID-19 IATI guidance, that came out really quickly. That was really welcome, very helpful. Lots of organizations use that guidance to publish data. When we started to look at the data, we found lots of organizations maybe just use the description text or the title to say COVID-19. Now, in many cases, that was quite logical. This project is about COVID-19, for example. But in other cases, we would find in description text, this project has changed because of COVID-19, or this project is no longer happening because of COVID-19, for example, or variations of. So we had to be really careful if we're using IATI data every day, every night. We're trying to use algorithms and machines to do that. We could falsely assume that some data is about COVID-19 when in actual fact it wasn't. And a lot of that was to do with description text in activities. So the false positives were, I think, welcome. It was a good challenge. We really looked into it, but we should be careful going forward about how we give guidance about these things, particularly in dense description text. So that was the first issue. The second thing that we found when we used IATI data every day, we really wanted to build these models of this is how much money has been committed, this is how much money has been spent. And we had quite interesting ways to calculate these values. But they relied on organizations publishing data fairly consistently, particularly with commitments, whether they be incoming or outgoing commitment transactions. And what we found sometimes in some organizations, the commitment transactions were either missing or they were meant to be outgoing, but they were incoming or outgoing. So what that meant was that even though we thought we could rely on all the IATI data to be fairly consistent, the inconsistency of commitments meant that that some data looked quite skewed or quite not how it should be. And here's an example of one organization that has spent, for example, 1.2 billion on COVID, but made no commitment or have no commitment around that. And we thought that was quite quizzical. We looked at that quite quizzically in terms of, is that right? Should we expect commitments? And we'd really welcome thoughts in the community about consistency of commitment transactions. So that was our second challenge issue. The third one would be around the depth, the amount of data that we would find when an organization had created an IATI activity that would have, for example, 3 countries and 4 sectors. And often when this type of data was held at the activity level rather than at the transaction level, what we would do with the project, we would split up all the transactions that were published into the various pieces that were given in the activity. So here we've got health at 45%, basic nutrition 31%, etc., etc. And we'd have to split up every transaction accordingly. But equally, when there were more than one country, in this case there were 3, we'd have to split them up even more. And we thought sometimes that starts to look a bit strange. It starts to look a bit strange when you've got a very small segment of a transaction in Canada in basic nutrition, for example, with this example here. And that led us to think sometimes it might not be useful to have these activities where there are lots of countries and lots of sectors at the activity level. It could be a lot more practical to have this data at the transaction level or split up those activities into smaller units. And we found that was a real challenge to help us be confident about the data when we would be splitting it up and splitting it up again, as you can see. So that presented another challenge, splitting up, processing these large activities. 2 more coming up, 2 more challenges. I'm just going to have a drink of water. A lack of precision. Excuse me. A lack of precision was our 4th challenge. And what we mean, what we found was interesting and useful here is that as we're discussing on IATI Connect at the moment, the COVID-19 sector code has been made available. It came through the OECD DAC channels and it's been available. But we found sometimes that that sector code was used as a flag, and it could replace more granular sectors. So if an activity were about education, suddenly it's all about COVID. So this lack of precision meant it was difficult to see within this, or where's the trends on vaccination, for example, or where's the trends in other elements of COVID. As we all know, COVID has taken and influenced and negatively influenced many parts of our society. So having one sector code just for COVID seemed a bit unhelpful for us in trying to understand deeper trends. And we also found there's a lack of precision for some organizations who want to be very clear at the transaction level what this transaction was for. The nature of the IATI standard meant it wasn't quite practical to do so. And we do say that in the report as well. But yeah, that lack of precision for some and lack of precision of wider sector codes did present challenges. The fifth and final challenge that we found in using IATI data every day that was about COVID-19 is perhaps not a new one, but this real lack of organizational consistency describing organizations in IATI data. So we would find very little use of the known references that we have for organizations, whether they're, particularly IATI publishers or multilaterals or donors. We wouldn't find real consistent use of that. We would also find organizations described in words, letters, in different ways. And this just made it really difficult for us to try and give a wider picture of where money is flowing between organizations. Because remember the mirror thing that I showed you earlier on, the cat, the mirror, for us to really give a flow diagram of a definitive flow diagram, we'd have to start editing data every day, and that's just not sustainable. So we were really challenged again by the lack of consistency between data sets in terms of how they describe themselves, the other organizations. It was a real issue. So those are the 5 things that we found using IATI data every day with our team, with our process. We did talk to people quite a lot at the beginning of the project and towards the end of the project, certainly. And I wanted to share just 3 things about this. And I like my colleague Sarah made this term making sense with IATI. I think is really helpful rather than making sense of IATI. So making sense with IATI, what we found is that people actually do want we called it at a glance visualizations, being able to see wider trends, wider things using IATI data than we typically may have done elsewhere. So that was a real key demand. People wanted to not just simplify IATI because it was too complicated, but really see things that would take a lot of time to process themselves. So this at a glance IATI, there seems to be a real key demand for that. And it does involve us also, for example, rolling up countries, so regions and sector codes, for example, when we need to. But this demand is there. People want to see, we think, IATI data in an at-a-glance format. The second thing that we found really interesting and people really valued is trends. And if you do work with IATI data, there's lots of dates in IATI data: transaction date, activity date, value dates, all these dates. And that made it quite straightforward for us to give these trend diagrams of spending commitments, for example. And again, we think that's really a real value that people have when they use IATI data to see trends over time. Particularly as we know that the pandemic has got a time frame in a sense, and it's interesting to see data over time there. And we know, for example, in dPortal there are nice graphs and such there, but the trends here that are wider than just activity level seem very engaging to people. And the final thing, I mentioned this one earlier on, this comparison between things seems to be very engaging to people. Comparing commitments and spending by country, for example, precisely in this graph that's in the data story. People were very engaged with this, very interested in this, And we have to also remember that behind this is all the IATI data that we're using and the processes and the algorithms that we have. But if people want to be engaged with IATI data, it seems these are the things that these are some of the things that they're asking for, and we can't just use an excuse of data quality to say that's not possible. It is possible, and people appreciated it with the nuances. Okay, so those are the things that people told us. Those are the issues I told you before. Now nearly there. We were keen today to share with you some higher level observations. Just be thinking, I can talk about commitments, data, and organization references all week, but I think it'd be really good to try and move it up a level to higher level things that we could all talk about the next couple of days. So a short thing, three things at higher level. Sorry, the first one. We think there are real barriers to data use. As a team, we spend a lot of time and effort doing really basic things with the data, both explaining IATI and explaining transactions, but also converting currencies, spotting for errors and such things. So we know there are tools around, we know validators exist, this is really, really helpful, but data seems to be consistently inconsistent. And the standard, as a colleague said in the plenary, is quite complicated. All those things together is just, we should remember it. There's a real barrier to using the data, we think, and that was evident in the beginning of our project. It was quite a thing to get going. So there's a barrier to data use. We think that there are a few feedback loops in IATI at the moment. So all this report and all the things I've shared with you so far. It's not quite clear where we take these recommendations. I could say I know where to do that, but for the team who are not familiar with IATI, they're not quite clear what to do and where to go forward. So we really do want to help with the things that we found and the processes and algorithms that we've written, but it's not quite clear both how to engage with the standard and to engage with publishers. So the feedback loops around IATI, there seem to be few and far between, and we think that's a thing to address and discuss. Thirdly, finally, the higher level insight. There are very few collective insights around IATI. So we found that organizations using the dashboard would generally always go and look at their own data. Quite rightly, you want to see what your data looks like, understand. But there's a real theme, we think, around the focus of IATI and compliance and individual organizations. Whereas what we really do need to think about, in our opinion, is we need to think about how our data works together. How do we get to that network of data that's talked about in the IATI strategy? How do we really understand what we can gain from a wider data set than just our own data sets on their own? And we think that's a real barrier, a real blocker going forward. We need to understand what we've got in common with the data, not just what our data does individually. So those are the three higher level insights we wanted to give and share today, and they're in the report that we published this morning as well. And the report gives a few recommendations. The recommendations at the publishing and the standard level, using transaction level sectors and countries more. Let's use transactions more consistently. I talked about that one. Identify partners more widely and consistently. We could use extensions to this schema and to explore some of these things and avoid this notion of free text as markers, in the description. So a lot of what I've talked about, we detail in the report how we should go about that and what the next steps might be. So that's recommendations we have for the IATI community, publishers and users to take things forward. And the second set of recommendations are more strategic and talk to those higher level issues we highlighted. And those are, let's think about IATI governance involving data users. Let's understand how we can govern the standard by talking very specifically with those that use the data or face barriers to use. And we know things like that are happening, but it'd be great to see more of. We think as well, guidance should involve best practice. We saw lots of really good practice publishing IATI data, and it'd be great to highlight that and include that in guidance, rather than just be descriptive about how things do work. So let's use the good practice we see and share that more widely. And the third point is this challenging point, I think, about we've got to focus on the collective story of IATI, not just that of individual publishers. And whilst it's great and right that we understand how the quality of each publication, we need to understand the quality of the whole of IATI data, or good parts of it at least. So those strategic recommendations are also in the report as well. And really, just to end on a bit more of a positive note, that I think, but I think it's okay. We think that in the report we say that the potential of IATI is just begun to be tapped. You know, there's really great things with IATI data, and we've shown what we think we could do with this small set of IATI data. So there's wonderful opportunities with the data, but we've got to make some improvements to the standard, the guidance, and governance to really get to that goal that we really cherish and share. Okay, that's good. We got some time, and thank you everybody for listening. I'm aware there's some questions in the box. I was petrified of going into breakout rooms or anything like that, so we're staying here and we're going to talk about this for the next few minutes. I don't know if Nick or Julia or anybody can help me with questions and such, but let's see where we go.
Yeah,
if there are any
I've
questions,
just summarized the questions and sent them directly to you. I can also read them to you if that would be more useful. Okay,
I've got some here. Thank you, Nick. Okay, so the first question, I think I can see, why we're using dportal, I think was the first one. Yes, we use dportal as the data source because at the time, so we started doing this in January, February this year, we couldn't really rely on the data store. Just be reminded, take down my, thank you, take down my screen share, thank you. We couldn't really rely on the data store to do this every day, whereas dportal and its queryable backend was really helpful, really useful. And we changed the query when we saw the COVID sector code come through really, overnight. Our colleague Mike in New Zealand did that, and the next morning the data arrived. So for our purposes, dportal, Michelle, was perfectly fine and scalable and robust.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I've got another question here from Murad, Global Fund. Yes. So Murad asks, related to double counting on financials, did you come up with an algorithm to address this in some way? We did, Murad. We look at the activities and we try and make calculations of the transactions in the activity, which we can then roll up into bigger numbers. We didn't look specifically at the function of traceability, where activities are connected, because that just wasn't there. There are pockets we know in the Dutch data, for example, but we just couldn't rely on that as a mechanism. So in the methodology, which we could spend a long time on, we had what we thought was a way to get through this, to not double count, but to use transaction types to understand the relative net spending or net commitments of an activity. And I have one other one from Herman here. Can it be helped that the standard is complicated? Doesn't it just reflect the complexity of development of humanitarian work? Thank you, Herman. That's a good point. I agree. I think there's some colloquial complexity around IATI. We really saw that when we were working with this team who were completely new to IATI, and we'd have a call about IATI, and then we'd say, oh yeah, but we meant this instead of this in terms of commitments or transactions. And I think maybe to answer your question more clearly, Herman, it's not perhaps the standard itself, but it's the use of the standard that's difficult to explain to people that want to use the data, because we saw so many differing uses of IATI, publishing of IATI data. But I think your point is really, really clear and stands. It's a standard. It has to be complicated and complex, but and we're not arguing to simplify it, but we should remember in the strategy we talk about simplifying the standard as well, standardizing the standard. Sorry. Okay. I don't know if anyone else wanted to speak too, but I'll carry on with the questions in there. And if anyone wants to say anything, that would be really helpful. That would be good. But Tanaka has a point. How do you suggest we strengthen feedback loops, especially for those who may be lone publishers new to IATI? yes, it's to everybody as well. So maybe someone else could chip in with this, but certainly, yeah, we talked about this around IATI for many years, about how do you feed back to USAID, for example, about their data, and that could be many different types of feedback, whether it's the validity of the data or the or wider issues, for example. I think our concern was more about how do we feed back to publishers when we're using the data, and that seemed to be quite difficult. Beyond those that we could talk to directly, because we know quite a few people, we didn't know how to reach out to some publishers to ask them about their publishing practice, and we didn't know how to scale that either. So yeah, again, the feedback loops could be strengthened, but we all need to think about that. Has anybody got any more things to say?
Stephen, if I may come on
thank you, Petra. Yeah,
I can speak to have more voices, but no, thank you very much for the presentation. I think to Tanaka's point on feedback loops, which I think it's really relevant and really good to hear the insights as well from your work. I know that there were some good examples. So of course, sometimes users can identify an email and contact an organizations, but we have a couple of examples where getting in touch directly with support and us creating that link. So I don't think that's, something that's scalable, but there have been examples where we were able to, reach out and kind of use, be able to be the mediator for those. I know there's probably some people in this group are aware. I know there's kind of a bit of a community effort with something on like Bug Tracker where some issues were raised and then fed back to some of our organizations. So there are, I think, some mechanisms. I think one of the challenges as well is identifying the most relevant contacts. I think in publisher, or I think Tanaka, to your point, or kind of more, publishers within organizations, and identifying the relevant people as well who would have the answer.
Thank you, Petra. Yeah, it's an ongoing story about feedback, and I agree with you. It can be different levels, and trying to understand where it's directed best and acted upon is quite a difficult thing. I saw a couple of hands up. I don't know if Nick or if there are some other people who want to make a comment, and I can read the chat and think about responses to that as well. Did some people have their hand up?
Yes, I did. Would you like me to come in now?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Faiza Effendi. I'm with UNDP. With the Bureau of Program and Policy. I am sorry I saw your presentation and benefited from the tail end of your presentation, but I did see your recommendations, and so one that caught my attention was the suggestion of strengthening IATI governance. I have put it in the chat box that we all recognize and appreciate that it is multi-layered and fairly distributed. So do you have any specific suggestions about how one might strengthen the governance of IATI to do all that you have mentioned, more on the technical side, and for IATI to really live up to the expectations of its member states, but also generally of the data community globally? Over.
Thank you. That's a really helpful question. I think I've been through changes to the IATI standard over 10 years, many changes to the IATI standard, and we don't seem to have anything planned at the moment. And I'm not saying we should be changing the standard just because we don't seem to have anything ready for that. And I think the opportunity now is that there is a real influx of data use. There's some really interesting projects there, including ours, but including others that are using IATI data systematically and have some very useful feedback to give about their usage of the data. And I think the strengthening of the already useful governance that we have in place is to try and understand how do we build in those data use feedback directly into the governance, not just to change the standard, but to hear the stories of what the problems are or the challenges are and how we can address them. I think maybe others may want to challenge or add to this, maybe before we've changed the standard, just because it might have been a nice idea, and we've not really challenged why we need to change the standard. And I would like to hear user evidence for changing the standard and have that discussion before we enter that, I think. And that's just, I think, just a final point there, that's just thinking about the standard and the changing of it and the governance. there are other wider aspects to governance, and it's also great to see that we have the tool of the working groups and the communities of practice that are beginning to really embed and hear user stories. So I think more of what we've got and more specificness around what we could have, I think might be my answer, Faiza. I don't know if that helps. I think you're
No, thank
muted.
you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
That's helpful to appreciate that sort of the angle from where you're coming, that, you know, somehow the governance mechanism needs to allow sort of these voices to be heard and see what changes can be then rapidly brought about through our work plan or other investments that are required. So I hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did we have any other hands up? Nick or Julia, did anybody? I saw some hands go up, and I know I can't quite see who's
that
in the
was
room.
Pecha and Faiza, so I don't see any other hands up right now, and I don't see any additional questions in the chat at this time. But folks, if you'd like to speak, please put your hand up or send me a message, or just unmute yourself and start talking.
I would like to ask people what this mildly controversial point that we make about we're very focused on our own data, not focused on the wider picture. And we know that there are real efforts to try and coordinate amongst data sets, but I think that there's a real fixation, it seems, on how good is my data. We know we measure each other's data against each other in indices and trackers. And I would welcome any thoughts from the community about how could we turn that into, well, how useful is this data in common with others? How can we really see the wider trends in the data, not just the specific goodness of one data set? And Herman, thankfully, has got his hand up, so that's good. Herman, to you, if I can see that correctly.
Yes, I'd like to comment on that. I think the focus on our own data is very much being stimulated by things like the IATI Transparency Index. The IATI Transparency Index measures you as an organization not on the usability of the data, but of how much and how frequently you publish your data. And I think what gets measured gets done. So if we want to change that dynamic, I think we should far more concentrate on the usability of the data in terms of being a part of a network, meaning technically getting your references right, getting the references to your funders right, getting the references to which the organization to which you give your money right, because then you can look at your place and your contribution in a network of actors within development and humanitarian aid, and that needs a different kind of measuring. And I think that's a key point if you want to change the focus of the publisher to the usefulness of the data for others.
Thank you, Herman. That's really good to hear. And I know there's a long-standing practice in the Netherlands with the MFA to do that. When you talk to organizations in your network, is that how you describe the usefulness of IATI? Because I think we mentioned this in the report. We think there's quite a bit of, oftentimes IATI is seen as a compliance. We're publishing IATI because our donor said we should. And how do we get over that hump of just doing IATI because? Anyone else as well is welcome to add to that.
Yeah, I think you can get over that hump by starting to use the data yourself. And then you see that you need the data of others in order to get the complete picture. And that will then challenge the quality of your own data, but also the data of others you want to use. And if you don't have the conversation about the quality of each other's publication and actually using the data, not only of yourself, but also of others, that's not going to change anything. I think it's very important that we look at ourselves not as an isolated white tower in nothingness of publicating good data and getting their good score on the Transparency Index, but that we should think what's our added value of our own data in the network. And that's a different kind of mindset.
Thank you, Herman. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and that's towards where we were going with that about the network of data. And we should remember, not everybody is involved in the Transparency Index. There were thousands, literally thousands of other publishers who are outside of that. But again, we have to think more widely. I saw 2 hands go up. Did we have anyone else? Michelle, I think, has got a hand up.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi. Thank you for this, Stephen. And there's a few things you said in there that I know you and our organization have worked on, and hopefully we'll get some good information and usable information. When it comes to using more than looking or doing it as more of a compliance, I mean, full and fair disclosure, IOM got involved because of the grand bargain, and it really was a compliance thing. And every time we get the surveys about data use, it's interesting because I pass it on to other folks within the organization, because while I'm the IATI project manager at IOM, I'm not the user of the data, other than to validate that we've made our data visible and compliant and things like that. I think the use case that you demonstrated just now with COVID is good. I think the conversation that USAID, obviously, the use of it and seeing where IOM is just used to, or our organization, there's people that work in our humanitarian space that have other data sets that they're very familiar with, and getting them to use a new data set when they aren't familiar with the schema, when we don't have technical in-house expertise that can data mine. That's why we hire you, Stephen. These are things I think that are the barrier to getting organizations to look at things beyond their own data, because if they don't have the in-house expertise and they don't know what the data can do, it's very hard to get them to see the value. So I don't know if there's possibilities of, it's not so much, well, I don't know. I think that's this, I don't have a solution for it, but it's being able to prove that the IATI data is as valuable, if not more so, than some of the other traditional sets that are out there. And I don't know how to bridge that gap, because I'm not even familiar with the traditional ones. Maybe David, who works in the HDX world, kind of knows what all these data sets are and what each can bring to the table, and comparing and contrasting what they have is an option. But as a non-technical person, I wouldn't even know how to data mine that. So that's the barrier for us to use the data. And it's a long-winded way of saying I don't really have solutions. I just sort of know why we aren't doing anything with the data other than checking our own compliance. Over.
Thanks, Michelle. No, I really hear you. Thank you for that. And using each other's data is a tricky barrier. We agree. Two things that we noted in this work: the way that we split transactions up and to get smaller figures, we think we have in common with Bill Anderson and the team and development initiatives when we talked with the data use working group. So one thing that we should align is how we use data together in a similar way, and make sure we do that and in effect standardize some data use. So that's one thing. And the other thing that was always in our mind with this project is that we should be able to reuse the tools that we're making, not for the next pandemic, but for another theme, another output. So we'd be really happy to work alongside others to try and reuse what's made, to look at the data from another lens rather than just COVID, because we might find out a bit more that way.
Yeah,
so
I think
Michelle.
That's huge. I think that's huge, Stephen. I think instead of having every single use case a bespoke issue, and being able to know that there's, it might not be 100%, but it's the 80-20 rule where you're not starting from scratch is huge, particularly, again, for those of us who don't have the in-house technical support and people that know how to grab the APIs and blah, 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 blah that's out there. That's very helpful.
Okay, thank you. So we'd encourage that. We've got less than 10 minutes, and I know we have to let people go to the next room. So that's good. So we've got 5 minutes, I think, or so. Faiza, I saw your hand go up.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to speak to your point about compliance. And coming from a country office, right, I must admit that the work burden every year for UNDP country offices, right, to populate and update their IATI portal is considerable. And this is, in fact, at least as a senior manager at the country level, I felt that there was a lot of duplication, right? We had our own systems, right, where our staff are uploading data, and then we had to do it separately for IATI. So I think one of the ways for us to overcome the issue and this attitude of that it's a compliance aspect, or the way it's perceived as a compliance, it can be mitigated if we can enhance the IATI functionality, that it becomes interoperable across different systems. So in fact, it can pick data from existing portals that are there for different organizations, and then can just take it to the portal, at least the ones that mandatorily need to be published. So I think that can be incredibly helpful, because both as a member of the IATI, but also as an IATI user, I must say that I have used this data and mined IATI data extensively. And when have I done that, and why did I find that extremely useful? Was, for instance, when they were audit reports, right? And so interestingly, in our organization, I can offer you a little bit of insight about UNDP, that if you go into our own audit system, which we call cards, we cannot access the audit reports of other regions or other country offices which are not in that specific region. But from IATI, right, if you go to the IATI portal, we can access all that data, even as a UNDP staff member. So I just want to give you a small anecdote. This is just to share a small anecdote about how useful and how important this particular portal is. So just that if we can, I think, enhance that interoperability, that it can actually pick up data from different portals without duplicative data entry, because sometimes, the staff members are doing nothing else for about 1 month other than just uploading the IATI portal. So I think that could really reduce that work burden, and therefore that feeling that we are just, doing it for the sake of compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiza. I think that's a really valuable point. We talked similarly around this about how IATI could become modular and interoperable. And by that, I mean, we spent a lot of time in this project extracting out from activities the transactions, the commitments, and the spending. We also know that that data does exist already in financial systems in some cases. So it sometimes seems counterintuitive that we've got to expect the data to come out of systems into IATI, and we're then reusing that in a very convoluted way, it would seem. So I would welcome a conversation, a working group around how we could be more modular and more interoperable. Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions. I need to look at the chat, but if there's anyone to say anything else, we've got a couple minutes, 1 more minute. Does anybody have any other points?
Yeah, I think the most recent message in the chat is the most recent question from Anand.
Okay, thank you, Anand. About the connection of FTS and IATI. So I worked on that prior to this project. I worked on how could we connect IATI, how could FTS, financial tracking service in UNOCHA, work with IATI data, and the consistent inconsistency of IATI data meant it couldn't be done automatically. It takes lots of curation, lots of work to understand what bits of IATI are useful to FTS and its reporting needs. So the short answer there is there isn't work at the moment being done on connecting the platforms, but I do think a lot of what we've learned here about how we summarize IATI, process IATI, could really help those that want to use at-a-glance figures and other things. So it's a good question. Thank you for bringing me back to that, and yeah, no, I haven't given up. Justin, thank you. Is there any other questions or any other points before we move on to our next room?
Can I just, my comment was a little bit vague maybe. But I mentioned that I'd really like to see IATI references in donor agreements or in pledge letters, because it speaks to this way that we're just publishing our own data and then looking at our own data and not worrying about everything anyone else. Like, I'd really like to see donors interested in the way that UNOCHA or I work publishing and providing us references to help us with that, and also for them to say, okay, we're publishing this way, you know, and having a dialogue that we discuss how we will publish their contributions to us. But no one is talking about that whatsoever.
Thank you, Justin.
It's disappointing. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. Over.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I think us having those frank conversations, candid talks, would be really helpful. So hopefully we've started some of that this afternoon, and look forward to the next couple of days and onwards. I think, unless there are any other points, we will. We've wrapped up everything in this project into a blog on the Centre for Humanitarian Data's website. So it's a blog summarizing this, and then the report that I mentioned, and then obviously the links to the data story and the dashboard. And if there's anything else, the other rooms there, Nick has just kindly posted them. So room 1, insights on publishers, findings from over 100 publishers. Sorry, I think things are, and then room 2, the moving the gender needle. Okay, very interesting. So there's 2 rooms. I think is there something in this room as well, colleagues?
And if you stick around in this room, it's Data Store Classic, Use, Progress, and Sustainability coming up 1:30.
Enjoy the lobby and the coffee and talking to each other.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks.